Welcome everyone to our March CERTL session. Today we're going to be talking about effective presentations for learning and some strategies and tips that we can use that are grounded in educational theory to make sure that our presentations are fostering student learning and not getting in the way of it. And so I thought I'd just kick off by asking for a show of hands or a couple quick examples. Have any of you ever had the experience of being part of a class period, a lecture, and feeling very overwhelmed by the amount of content in a PowerPoint presentation? Anyone had that experience? Yeah, I see Condra's raising her hand. Yeah, it can be very common. And so what I hope is by the end of this, that we're in a place where we have a few tips and tricks under our belts to make sure that we aren't overwhelming our students, at least as best we can, by the design of our slides and the structure of them. So by the end of today, what I'm hoping is that we're able to describe the relevance of a particular learning theory, this multimedia learning theory, and how it applies to these in-person presentations or Zoom presentations, really particularly with an eye towards PowerPoint, although this applies more broadly than that as well. And I also hope that you're able to explain this concept called cognitive overload and list a few strategies, easy things that we can do within our presentations to avoid it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take everything that we've learned, and I've got a sample PowerPoint presentation that was designed by a graduate student who is in our graduate teaching assistantship program. She developed them for a micro teaching experience. And I thought we could look at her slides and talk about some of the things that she did very effectively to help use her PowerPoints to foster learning. Are there any questions before I go further about where we're headed today? Does it line up with what you were thinking we'd be doing?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, the first thing that I want to do is frame the concepts that we'll be going over around a few assumptions. And the first assumption, and you could probably gather this from the other sessions that you've attended, is that learning is not passive. And so I love this picture because it just always brings up this question for me. Wouldn't it be nice, right, if learning were this easy, right? We could just float some books around our head. We could just read some things. We could see some things. We would absorb it and it would stick. I could read you, from a book, we would all be experts, myself included, but we know instinctively from our own experiences as students that there's much more to this process. And so the second assumption is this idea that knowledge is constructed. And as you probably have heard this term already, or you will hear it the more entrenched you get in these educational concepts. You may have heard this term constructivist approach thrown around. It comes from a constructivist learning theory. And the main idea is that learning is an active process. While we are teaching, students are actively processing this information. They're taking it in, they're making meaning, they're constructing models, they're connecting what they're learning to what they already know, they're recalling past information, all of these kinds of things. And so the reason this is important is how we balance the presentation of information plays a big role in either facilitating that learning or potentially getting in the way of it, right? So I want to dive a little bit deeper into this cognitive theory and give a little bit of history and structure for this. So Richard Mayer is a psychology professor, and he's been instrumental in developing theories about multimedia learning and cognition. And his work is grounded on three principles. The first is this dual channel. And what that means is we process verbal and auditory information in one mental channel, right? And that is depicted here in this diagram with the blue lines. That's our verbal auditory channel. And then we process visual or pictorial information through an entirely different channel, and that's depicted in green. So I kind of think of this as like AM and FM radio waves, if you remember kind of the old days of radio. And they're coming into the receiver through different transmission methods. The information is processed through our senses, whether our eyes and ears, And we as learners go through the work of integrating it, right? Connecting it to things that we already know. So related to this is this idea of limited capacity. And the assumption is that what we're able to present auditorily through words, through pictures, that is unlimited, right? There's an infinite amount of things that could be presented. Equally unlimited is the capacity of our long-term memory to store information. But where things are limited is in this intermediate step, and that we can only hold a few pieces of information from each channel at a time in our working memory. And working memory is where new information is getting processed. And then the third principle to talk about here with respect to this theory is this idea of active processing. And what that means is that in order to learn, there's substantial cognitive processes happening in each channel. And this includes paying attention to the material, organizing it into those frameworks, and then integrating it with things we already know. And so all of this comes into play when we think about designing presentations where we're trying to prevent this concept called cognitive overload, right? And what that means, and this flows from all of the principles of Mayer that we just reviewed. Cognitive overload is that point that you may have experienced in your learning where you just feel like, I can't take in another thing, right? If this class is 10 more minutes, I'm maxed out. Like I am up here. The processing demands evoked by the learning task are exceeding the processing capacity of the cognitive system. You may even hear students describe this as like, I'm fried, right? When you think of a motherboard on a computer, I'm fried out. There's just too much information that is coming. Excuse me. It's really important to note this is not the same thing as intelligence. This is not describing the person's ability to eventually understand these concepts. It literally means that they can't possibly take in anymore. They are just overstimulated with respect to all of the information coming through those channels. Any questions about that? Well, one of the things I want to do is I want to go back a slide, because one of the things that can happen when we are designing presentations is that we can contribute to this cognitive overload by putting too much information on a slide. And I intentionally did that with this slide right here. So did anybody feel as I was talking, as I was going through this information, that it was a little bit hard to process all of the diagram on the slide and all of the text at once? Anyone have that experience of being like, whoa? Yeah, it's okay. You can you can be honest, it was the point. Right? So what I want to do is I want to share that same information with one little tweak in my slides. So I'm just going to jump forward here too. Okay. So now what I would like to do is I would like to give you some information about this cognitive multimedia theory of learning. So Richard Mayer is the developer of this theory, and he is a psychology professor who has been instrumental in developing theories about multimedia learning and cognition. And his work is grounded on three assumptions. The first is a dual channel assumption. And what this is saying is that we process verbal and auditory material through one mental channel, and that's depicted here in blue. Move this over. I think you guys are seeing the edge of that. And then we process visual and pictorial information in another channel, which is reflected in the green. So I think of this like AM, FM radio waves coming into a receiver, which is our brain, through different transmission methods. The information is processed through our senses, like our sight and sound, and we as learners go through the work of integrating it. The second assumption is called limited capacity. And what this is saying is that we are able to present virtually unlimited information through our eyes and our ears, right? Auditory and visually. And also, the capacity of our long-term memory is also almost unlimited. However, our working memory is the piece in the middle that connects those two. And we can only hold a few pieces of information, new information, in our working memory at a time. So it's really important when we're learning something new to make sure that we're being mindful of how much new information is coming into that working memory space. And then the third is active processing. And what that is saying is that to learn, there are cognitive processes occurring in each channel, which include paying attention to the material, organizing it into frameworks so that we can understand it, and integrating it with things that we already know. Okay. So it's basically almost a word for word repeat. But did you guys have a different experience given the nature and the structure of the different slide there?
Yeah, I feel like there was less competition between the words and the graphic on the slide. So easier to
Yes.
focus on one of them, on the graphic, really.
Yes. Yes. Less competition, less input, right, coming in there. So that cognitive load was lower. Any other observations about the differences between those two slides?
They are connected too, so sound and images connected.
Can you say that? I heard something about
I mean,
images, Simone. It was
working memory, the sounds of the images it have an interaction with each other.
yes. So you were able to focus more on the image in the second one and kind of see how it was connecting to what I was saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. When there's a lot of text on a slide, we can read faster than we can hear. So when we're looking at text on a slide, we're trying to read it because we know we can read that quickly. But if my pace of speech is different than your ability to read those words, it's almost like having feedback, right? Like in that loop, and that's assuming I'm reading it directly. If I'm saying something different than what's on the slide, then we're kind of getting it from all the different angles, right? So limiting text on a slide can play a huge role in reducing that cognitive overload and helping your students be able to retain that information. All right, thank you for indulging me by hearing the same information twice there for that example. So now what we're going to talk about are some strategies for reducing cognitive overload in PowerPoint in particular, right? And surprise, this very first slide is actually one of the strategies. This is a segment. It's called segmenting. So I've broken up my presentation and I am introducing the fact that we're shifting gears here by having a new title slide to indicate that shift in my presentation, right? So just by the process of introducing a new title, it's indicating, okay, we're switching gears here, we're moving on to something else, and now I am anticipating, I'm starting to do some of the mental work of anticipating where this might be going. So even the simple act of segmenting can do a lot to reduce that cognitive overload. Oh, yeah, surprise, strategy one. So here are some other ways that you might think about segmenting your presentation to get students even more involved and engaged in what they have just processed to help it transfer over into that long-term memory. So one idea is you might just add a slide here. You might segment it after a particular moment in your presentation. Say you've presented for 10 minutes or so. You might say, I want you to take 2 or 3 minutes and write down the thing that is most confusing for you right now. What is your muddiest point? That's what muddiest point refers to. So students are given a moment to kind of pause, reflect, look back at their notes, think about what they've just processed, and think about what they're still fuzzy about. Use that to write that down, and then a few could share that idea with you as the instructor, and then you could do a bit of clarifying before moving on to the next section. So it's using PowerPoint to introduce an active learning technique that is known to help students retain new information, this idea of a muddiest point. You could ask them to write down 3 questions they have, right? Something like that. Instead of just saying any questions, right? Which people feel awkward and shy about doing that. You might ask them, please do this activity. I want to hear what your question is. I'm expecting there to be questions, right? Another way that you can use this title slide, the segmenting, is to ask students to reflect with one another. So you can just say, we're going to take 2 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, please just, maybe you give them a prompt, maybe you ask them to compare their notes with what their neighbor has taken so that they can kind of clear up any misconceptions there. Again, you're just segmenting, you're providing a pause, but not just a pause, you're asking them to do something in that pause that's going to help them retain that information longer term. Any questions about that? Okay. So another strategy that I like to talk about has the potential to not have anything to do with PowerPoint, but it's such a powerful concept when we're thinking about education, and it's this idea of alignment. And all of you have come to other presentations, and you know that we've talked about alignment when we're talking about assessments and objectives and activities. All of those things need to be connected to each other so that students know where they're headed. The same thing is true in PowerPoint. We want to make sure that everything in our presentations supports the objectives. And I know this sounds very simple and basic, but there's so many temptations to stuff information into a presentation. And I just want to talk a little bit about where some of those temptations might be rooted, so that you can be aware of them as you're designing your own presentations. So one of the reasons that this can be so difficult is that you know more about the content than you are probably teaching in that moment, right? And so it can feel like you are doing a disservice to your students not to include all the information that you know. But as we've talked about when we're talking about framing learning objectives and assessments, right? Students are learning at a moment in time, and we need to be mindful of where they are in that moment in time. Just because we know it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right time and place to share that information with our students, and we don't want to overload them. We don't want to contribute to that cognitive overload. I think a lot of times when students raise their hands and say, is this going to be on the test? Is this going to be on the test? To me, that's always an indicator that they're feeling overloaded, right? And they're not quite sure how to process the information and where they need to focus their attention. Another thing that can happen when you're designing a presentation is that there's new research, there's new elements to this subject matter that are really interesting to you, but again, that your students may not be quite ready for. You also may be worrying that, oh, at the curriculum level, like how are they going to be ready for the next class, the next level? And all of these feelings are valid, but I can promise you that overstuffing your presentation is going to have the opposite effect, right? It could have the impact that they don't even remember what you intended them to remember. And then finally, and particularly related to PowerPoint, this idea of alignment applies to the images that you pick. Have you ever had the experience of watching a PowerPoint? Maybe it was created with a PowerPoint template and the visuals don't match up with what you're learning at all. Have you ever seen that? Like why is there a picture of a cat on here? Or, whatever it is. Anytime a student is trying to figure out what is the point of that image, that is a moment that they are not processing your content, right? So if your images don't line up, if they're just kind of cute or extra, students are going to be trying to make a connection that isn't there, and that's wasting their mental energy, right? Now, just to back up, that's not to say that as an instructor, you can't build rapport by talking about your cat or sharing a little picture about what they did, but we just need to know that it's separate from the presentation, right? So maybe you want to start the first 5 minutes of class telling about your new puppy and the new puppy chewed up all your shoes and you have a picture of it. That's fine. But we just want to make sure that when it's time to switch into the actual content, it's very clear that we're pivoting and shifting gears. Does that make sense? Okay, so alignment with our objectives, making sure that we're aligned with, we're not adding extra information that's beyond where the students are learning, and that our images are also aligned to what we're teaching. Okay, so another strategy that we can do when we're working with PowerPoints is this thing called weeding. And that is the strategy that I used in those 2 slides, the slide that I repeated. Right, so the first slide, like this one, had a lot of text on it in addition to that graphic image, right? So here's one from a workshop I gave about writing rubrics, right? These are a sentence or two about some of these strategies for writing rubrics. But if I were going to make this, redesign that slide with cognitive overload in mind, I might just do something like this, right? Really just get at the essence and then let my narration, let my lecture fill in the rest. Even better is to take advantage of that animation feature, right? So students are only looking at one bullet at a time, and they're only looking at the newest bullet is the one that I'm talking about now, right? So that's another way to do that. Animation can really be your friend when you're thinking about cognitive overload with students. All right, here's another one too, offloading. This is talking about the relationship between images and visuals on a slide. And sometimes a picture may do everything that you want it to do, and you may not need all that bulleted text, right? So in this slide right here, this was coming at the end of a narrated presentation. It was for an asynchronous class, so it wasn't delivered live, but it was a recording. And so you can see here, there's an opportunity to practice this kind of journal reflection. And she's got this header here. Let's try it. She's got some instructions here in the bullet points that she's also repeating out loud in the recording. We've got a quote here that she's not reading, but it's connected to what she's talking to us about writing a gratitude journal. And we have a picture of her journal here. So even though it's clean-ish, there's still a lot going on and a lot to connect. So we just offloaded some of the visual information to the auditory information and just relied on her narration to do the heavy lifting. So we made the whole slide the image. We're still giving the kind of orientation header, right? We're checking in with ourselves again. She's giving these instructions here in the narration. And then we've got the quote here, right? So we still have all of that information. It's just, we're just pruning it a little bit. Any observations about this? Thoughts? Pretty straightforward. I think the great thing about these strategies, they don't require a lot of whiz-bang technical know-how, right? It's just a matter of being very intentional about what you're putting on a slide, and thinking about the impact of all that information on the students. All right. So now I'd like to take a minute and share with you that presentation I was describing earlier, so we can talk about how this student is implementing some of these strategies in her presentation. Again, this is a student in the School of Pharmacy named Josie Dalgadan-Rosande, and she is studying for her PhD this idea of mass spectrometry. So she was teaching us very newbies this information. So I'm just going to go through slide by slide and have you notice and call out some of the things that we've talked about and how she's doing it. So I have her notes here because this is way outside my knowledge area. So, okay, so she introduces herself and she says, I will refer to mass spectrometry as MS for short. Okay, so by the end of this lesson today, I'm hoping that you're able to define mass spectrometry and explain its importance in analytical chemistry, to describe the basic principles and components of a mass spectrometer, and to demonstrate the applications of mass spectrometry in various fields. So what comes up for you as you look at this slide with some of the principles that we've talked about already? What do you notice? Oh, I think you might be muted. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just from this presentation, what was the object and what we have to know, what we have to learn.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's focused, one slide just on the objectives. Yeah.
Everything is pointed out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man.
Yeah, it's very clear. So I don't understand what mass spectrometry is, but yeah, my wife
Yep.
is doing
Me neither.
wife is doing PhD in that subject. So
Yeah,
but
yeah, same. No, but we can appreciate the cleanness of the slides, and there
Yeah.
is some alignment with the images in the sense that they are related to this kind of chemical observational thing, right? So
and
so there's
it's very easy, like how she has designed, because it's all starting with D. So 3D is like define, describe, and demonstrate. So that's very
yes,
easy to catch up.
yes, the power of threes. So now we know where we're going, right? Okay. So now she's saying, okay, so let's talk about what MS is. Mass spectrometry is a powerful analytical technique used to determine the masses of particles and the elemental composition of a sample or molecule. For example, you have a biological sample here with different molecules and compounds, such as DNA and proteins, and maybe is that, and lipids and others. And you can inject this sample inside the mass spectrometer for analysis to identify and quantify these molecules. So what principles do you see here? Just again, forgetting the content, but just in terms of thinking about the cognitive load and the presentation principles that we've talked about, what do you see in action here?
So this is some pics.
Some
Some pics. So
pictures.
So the peaks, that is the intensity, and it is the concentration, right? So that's the peaks. Some is lower, some is higher.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so that's kind of on the content side. But what do you notice about the choices she made in terms of how to present this information on the slide itself?
I think I feel like you mentioned strategy number 4, when actually there's like a only visual on the slide, but auditorial the way. So it's actually easy to follow as you talk. I mean, as the presenter talks, kind of match the picture and content. I don't
Yeah.
remember what's the strategy number 4 called though.
Yeah, I can't remember the numbers on them either, but that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Her choice here to only go with images, right, and not have bullets or information, really just lets you look at this picture and see, okay, we've got this sample, we're going to put it in there, and we're going to get some graphical information, right? And then they can use the words of the presenter to kind of fill in those gaps, right? But she did a very intuitively great job of reducing that cognitive overload by sticking just with pictures here. All right. So here we go. These are some examples of the mass spectrometers we have in our mass spectrometry center at UMB. As you can see, they come in different shapes and sizes, and each type is optimized for specific analytical purposes and offers different advantages and capabilities. Any other thoughts here on the design decisions?
I think maybe for this, I wouldn't have gone with, because some of the pictures are, or part of the machine is sort of not in the picture.
Uh-huh.
And maybe a little less fun, I guess, would be
Mhm.
like just to show like this is what a complete, just show the full instrument. But
Yeah, so the idea
Yeah.
behind having the pictures is good, but
Mhm.
maybe you want to
Yeah.
see more of them,
Yeah.
more
But
of the machine.
I guess that is the steps what we need to go through this machine. It's
Ah,
from each
good.
step,
Okay.
what happened, one. But I mean, it would be nice to say 1, 2, 3, 4, right?
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you said that. Hang on. Hang on.
Right.
Here we go. All right. So now she's going to describe the components and the process, right, of using this machine. So first you have your sample being injected into the MS instrument. The first component is an ion source, which is responsible for ionizing the sample to generate charged molecules, what we call ions. Then these charged molecules go through a mass analyzer, where these ions are separated based on their mass and charge ratio. Then a detector will record the abundance of these ions. Finally, you end up with a mass spectrum where you have the mass to charge ratio in this graph here on the x-axis and the ion abundance on the y-axis. So what do you notice here about the cognitive load and the PowerPoint tools that she used? Yes, Saman.
So that is the process. What is the sample? That is the 1, 2, 3, 4, and that is the detector. It's the product, what we get at the end as a result.
Yes, exactly. How effective were the animations in your point of view?
Beautiful. And it's easy to catch up and clear, crystal clear. And it's
Yeah.
very complicated process for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other thoughts about the design decisions on this?
And even that shows what happened in the instrument because it's a gray.
Uh-huh.
The gray that is what happened in the machine.
Yes.
Yeah,
She kind of graphically designed a very basic machine, right? By changing the background color into that darker gray. That's exactly right. So you almost get the sense of like the sample going into the machine, these three things happening, and then taking it out of the gray to show us the result, right?
Yeah.
Really good observation.
Mhm.
Right. And you can see, again, you don't have to be a graphic designer. You don't have to be really skilled in all the whiz bang, features or of PowerPoint or whatever, but just these simple things reinforce this idea of a product going into a machine, a process, and a result. Any other thoughts? Yeah, great. Okay, let's move. There's only a couple more here. So what information can we extract from a mass spectrum? Well, first we can identify the molecular weight measured in mass to charge ratio. We can determine the elemental composition, meaning what kinds of compounds and molecules we have in our sample based on an accurate mass measurement of isotopic pattern of atoms. We can extract structural information of specific compound based on the fragmentation of these ions, these charged molecules. And then finally, we can quantify these ions based on their abundance. What strategies do you notice here? Is there anything visually that she did on this slide that you could imagine helping a student process the information? Yeah, Conjure.
So just using the animation, right? Like only talking about a point before making the next one visible. So there's less information on this slide as you speak.
Yeah. Did you find your eyes going to just the newest component as I was talking, right? The other ones still were there, right? We didn't need to make those go away necessarily, but we're focusing our attention on the new one.
Yeah.
Right. She's got some color coding going on here too, right? So signaling that the things in blue are a little bit more detail, a little bit more information, but still not the full text of what I was saying. Right. It's just a highlight snippet of that. Yeah. Great. Great. And here's a slide where she just goes through kind of how this tool can be used. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but again, we've got this animated here. And then look at this title slide with an activity. So when you scan, you don't have to do this, but when you scan this QR code, you're taken to a quiz in Socratic or Pull Everywhere, something like that, where she's testing the recall of the information that you've just learned. Right. So she's, again, using PowerPoint to provide a breathing space in the presentation for students to go through and think about and process and activate what they have already learned. Right. And that goes a long way to helping make that transition into the long-term memory. Any questions about this or thoughts? I'm so excited to show you this example because this is a graduate student, right? And so these are principles that, again, don't need high PowerPoint skills, high graphic skills, but they can go a really long way in making sure that our students are staying with us during the meaty part of our presentations. Let's see, she's got some resources here. Oh, and then she provides some opportunities for questions, right? So I think one trick here that I always like to point out is there's always this kind of awkward pause when she says, does anyone have any questions? And so part of that awkward pause in a lecture can come from students are thinking about their questions, but it can also come through the fact that students may be feeling vulnerable and not sure if they want to be the one to voice that question. And so one of the ways that you can phrase this to reduce some of that anxiety is to say, I'd like to hear 3 questions before I move on to the next part of my lecture. So you're creating the expectation that there should be, and that, you know, you are hinging the rest of the presentation on hearing 3 questions so that it's absolutely normalizing the fact that at this point, there should be a few questions. Just one little trick there. That has nothing to do with PowerPoint, but instead of saying any questions, let's hear 3, right? So that is really the gist of what I wanted to explore with you. Does anybody have any questions or observations or any thoughts about how they've seen PowerPoint used effectively or ineffectively?
So I've definitely used the sectioning strategy. I find it also helps me like make a smooth transition. Because you know, sometimes you're talking and you just, but it helps to like, or bring you back to things. And also like a point of, I feel like it's a good point to also ask for questions or thoughts or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, yeah, a tool that I've used.
Yeah, like a back to center.
Mhm.
Right? It's kind of regroup.
Yeah.
Gives the eyes a break too, right? Like people don't feel as pressured to be staring intently at a screen that's just a transitional slide. So it can help with that eye strain also. Any other thoughts about these techniques? Yes, Saya.
I remember attending one of the workshops about ethical consideration, and I also noticed that sometimes it was actually, I really like how the presenter were able to share the content in a way it was sometimes even enough to hear them rather than just looking at hear them. So when I wanted to kind of like really, I don't know if it makes sense. If I want to really like capture what he was saying, I was kind of looking at the screen, but also I didn't have to look at the screen to really gather content. So I feel like that was in a way kind of actually visual and auditory was separated, but in a way was helpful. And if I feel like I need the visual to understand the concept that they were sharing, I kind of looked at the screen, but sometimes I didn't have to look at the screen, which helped me actually to focus only on the voice sometimes. So I found it was helpful. And I feel like this also reflects on one of the strategies. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Actually, a pretty good principle that I haven't thought of it before.
Yeah. So what was on the slide itself, or was there nothing on the slide? How was it structured?
It was a couple of visuals. It wasn't actually like, yeah, it was a very, very clear slide. It was easy, but I felt like I didn't because sometimes you feel like if you don't look at the slide, you actually miss something because they don't really. The presenter sometimes assumes that you look at the slide and listen to them, which is actually cognitively like it's hard to do at the same time. So I like that they structure the talking points as almost a story, one first, second, and if you want to kind of spend more attention, take more attention, you can look at the slide. And like the slide was very clear. It was kind of a couple images, couple words. It wasn't too much too.
Yeah, so a very pared down slide. And that helped with that dual channel, right? Because you could focus 100% on the auditory if you wanted to, and then that visual reinforced it if and when you needed it, but you didn't feel trapped by having to look and then panicking like, am I catching every word that's being said? I think that is such a wonderful encapsulation, such a wonderful example of that dual channel processing in action, right? And how it can feel a little panicky, right? When you're not sure where to put that attention, but it sounds like that gave you the gift of knowing, okay, I can just listen and I don't feel like I'm missing something. Yeah, thank you. Also, I just want to call out that idea of storytelling. And that is such an important point as well. It's not necessarily connected to PowerPoint, but we as humans are wired to hear stories, right? It is almost always easier to remember something that's been told to you through an engaging story, through those storytelling techniques. And that is another thing that can go a long way toward improving that retention, right? Not all of our content lends itself to kind of a 3-act drama, but there may be moments, right, in a lecture, an example, right? Some of the feedback that Josie got on her presentation is that either as an opening or a closing, it might have been neat to hear a story about how this tool provided new information that changed the way particular something was seen, right? Like she was something about foodborne pathogens, right? So they could use mass spectrometry to identify that something had been contaminated, and that's used in kind of an epidemiological kind of way. Well, that story, then suddenly I'm like, oh, this tool can help people from getting really sick. So now I'm kind of wired to want to hear more about it because I've been primed by that story. Any other thoughts? No? All right, well, I'm going to put this QR code. Let me share my screen again. This is the code that you can use to indicate that you attended today's session. We'll also put this recording up on the website. So if any of your colleagues, your fellow grad students or postdocs in your department weren't able to make it today, they'll be able to watch it and do the same thing and record their participation through that. So I'll leave this up here for a second, but other than that, I just thank you for your participation today and look forward to seeing you in April.